In the age before the Great Reset, the antediluvian kings lived for nearly a millennium. Then, in a single generation, a ceiling was placed on human life. Genesis 6 verse 3 records the exact moment our days were numbered to 120 years. Was this a divine decree or a genetic kill switch encoded into our telomeres? We are investigating the biological intervention that turned humanity into a short-lived labor force. Because the numbers in Genesis are not poetry. They are not mythological exaggeration. They are a medical record. And when you lay them against what molecular biology has discovered about the architecture of human aging, a picture emerges that is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of science, or evidence that something deliberately reached into the human genome and reset the clock. The question isn't whether the lifespan collapsed. It did. The question is why, and who, or what, had the authority, the motive, and the mechanism to do it. And why does the church refuse to ask the question out loud? The genealogies of Genesis 5 read like a mortality table from another species. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912. Enosh lived 905. Kenan lived 910. Mahalalel lived 895. Jared lived 962. Enoch, the one man who didn't die but was taken directly by God, lived 365 years before his translation. Methuselah, the longest-lived human in Scripture, reached 969 years. Lamech lived 777. Noah himself lived 950. These are not round numbers invented for symbolic effect. Symbolic numbers in ancient Scripture cluster around figures like 7, 40, 70, 100, 1000. The numbers in Genesis 5 are irregular, precise, and internally consistent across generations. They read the way a genealogical record reads, not the way mythology reads. And then the flood comes, and everything changes. Shem lives 600 years after the flood. Arphaxad lives 438. Shelah lives 433. Eber lives 464. Peleg lives 239. Ru lives 239. Serug lives 230. Nahor lives 148. Terah lives 205. And Abraham, the father of faith, the man God chose to begin a new covenant with humanity, lives 175 years. The decline is not gradual. It is not random. It is a controlled descent, tracked across exactly 10 generations post-flood, dropping from near millennial lifespans to something approaching our own biological ceiling in a time frame that, by any actuarial standard, is not natural. Something intervened. The text tells us exactly when. Genesis 6 verse 3. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Modern translations debate whether those 120 years refer to the remaining time before the flood or to a new lifespan limit imposed on humanity. But the rabbinical tradition is unambiguous. The Talmud, the Midrash, and the earliest church fathers all read Genesis 6 verse 3 as a biological decree, a ceiling placed on human life by divine authority. Moses himself died at exactly 120 years, as if to demonstrate the precision of the limit. Deuteronomy 34 verse 7 notes that at his death his eyes were not dim and his vigor had not diminished, meaning Moses hit the ceiling at full biological capacity. He didn't die of age. He died because 120 was the imposed limit, not a natural death, a programmed termination. The question that nobody in a seminary classroom wants to ask is this: if God set this limit, what was the mechanism? Because God works through creation, through natural law, through the physical architecture of the world he made. When God hardened Pharaoh's heart, he worked through Pharaoh's own psychology. When God sent the plagues, he worked through biology and atmospheric chemistry. So when God decreed 120 years as the human lifespan limit, what biological mechanism did that decree engage? The answer is sitting in every cell in your body right now, and it has a name: telomeres. At the end of every chromosome in every human cell sits a repetitive sequence of DNA called a telomere. Think of it as the plastic cap on the end of a shoelace. Every time a cell divides, the telomere shortens slightly. When the telomere reaches a critical minimum length, the cell enters senescence, stops dividing, and eventually dies. This is the Hayflick limit, named for Leonard Hayflick, who discovered in 1961 that human cells can only divide approximately 50 times before they stop. 50 divisions. After that, the cellular machinery winds down. The tissue degrades. The organism ages and dies. This is not disease. This is not damage. This is a programmed biological clock built into the architecture of human DNA. Now here is where it becomes theologically and scientifically explosive. The maximum theoretical lifespan calculated from telomere biology and the Hayflick limit, assuming optimal conditions, minimal oxidative stress, perfect nutrition and environment, is approximately 120 years. Not 150, not 200, 120 years. The same number God spoke in Genesis 6 verse 3. Mainstream science arrived at this number through cellular biology in the 20th century. The text of Genesis recorded it approximately 3,400 years ago. Either Moses was the greatest cellular biologist in human history, or the decree of Genesis 6 verse 3 is a description of a biological event. A moment when the telomeric architecture of the human genome was deliberately reset to impose a 120-year ceiling on human life. But this raises the deepest question of all. If the ceiling is 120 years, how did the pre-flood patriarchs live for 900? Their cells divided. Their chromosomes had telomeres. The same physics applied. So either their telomeric architecture was fundamentally different from ours, or the pre-flood environment maintained telomere length in ways our post-flood world does not, or both. The Book of Enoch, which the early church used extensively and which Jude quotes directly in the New Testament, contains a detail that the canonical text passes over. It describes the antediluvian world as having a different sky, a firmament that functioned differently, a canopy above the atmosphere that the Enochian tradition describes as waters above the expanse. The Genesis account confirms this. Genesis 1 verse 7 describes God separating waters above the firmament from waters below. Genesis 7 verse 11 says that at the flood, the windows of heaven were opened, meaning the canopy collapsed. The flood wasn't just water rising from below. It was the catastrophic collapse of an atmospheric water canopy that had surrounded the earth since creation. And here is what that canopy would have done to the human genome. Filtered ultraviolet radiation is one of the primary causes of DNA damage and telomere shortening. UV radiation breaks the phosphate backbone of DNA, generates free radicals that oxidize telomeric sequences, and accelerates the Hayflick limit by damaging the protective caps on chromosomes. A water vapor canopy above the atmosphere would have filtered UV radiation far more effectively than our current atmosphere does, creating a biological environment where telomere degradation was dramatically slower. Pre-flood humans weren't a different species. They were the same genome operating in a protected environment. When the canopy collapsed, the UV exposure increased catastrophically. The telomere degradation rate accelerated, and the lifespan curves of Genesis 10 and 11 document the biological consequence of that atmospheric catastrophe in real time, across real generations, in numbers precise enough to track the descent. This is where epigenetics enters the investigation and makes the case even more disturbing. Epigenetics is the study of heritable changes in gene expression that don't involve changes to the DNA sequence itself. Environmental factors, diet, stress, radiation, chemical exposure, can switch genes on or off, and those switches can be inherited by offspring. The field was considered fringe science 30 years ago. Today it is mainstream biology. What epigenetics tells us is that the environmental catastrophe of the flood could have triggered heritable epigenetic changes that were passed down through every subsequent generation. The collapse of the canopy didn't just expose Noah and his family to increased UV radiation. It reprogrammed their epigenome in ways their children inherited, and their children's children, and every human being alive today. The Tower of Babel narrative adds another layer that the text hints at but doesn't fully explain. Genesis 11 places the dramatic lifespan collapse not at the flood itself, but in the generations immediately following. Peleg, whose name means division, is born in Genesis 10 verse 25, and the text notes that in his days the earth was divided. His lifespan, 239 years, already dramatically shorter than his immediate ancestors. Something happened in Peleg's generation beyond the flood. A second intervention. A second reset. And the scattering of humanity at Babel, the deliberate fragmentation of the unified human population, created isolated gene pools that accelerated the fixation of the shortened lifespan epigenetic changes. Small isolated populations fix genetic and epigenetic traits far faster than large mixed populations. The scattering at Babel wasn't just linguistic. It was biological. God used population genetics to ensure the 120-year ceiling was locked into every human lineage simultaneously. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church includes in its biblical canon and that the Dead Sea Scroll community at Qumran treated as scripture, provides a detail that sits uncomfortably between theology and molecular biology. It states that after the flood, God altered the nature of human flesh so that it would no longer carry the strength of the former age. That phrase, the strength of the former age, is the Jubilees text's way of describing something biological, not spiritual weakness, not moral corruption, physical capacity, the structural integrity of biological material. Modern longevity research has identified specific gene variants associated with exceptional lifespan. The FOXO3 gene variant associated with human centenarians. The ApoE2 allele associated with reduced Alzheimer's risk and extended cognitive function. The CTP variant associated with cardiovascular longevity. What these variants share is that they appear to partially resist the epigenetic shutdown mechanisms that terminate normal human cellular function. They are, in the language of the Jubilees text, remnants of the strength of the former age. Fragments of a genetic architecture that hasn't been completely overwritten by the post-flood reset. And here is the detail that should stop you entirely. The populations with the highest concentrations of FOXO3 longevity variants are geographically clustered in regions that align precisely with the post-Babel dispersion routes described in Genesis 10, the Table of Nations. Sardinia, Okinawa, certain Caucasian highland communities. These aren't random. They are the populations that maintain the greatest genetic isolation after the Babel scattering, preserving higher concentrations of pre-reset genetic material in their relatively undiluted lineages. The prophet Isaiah records God saying in chapter 65:20 that in the restored age, the one who dies at 100 years will be considered a mere youth, and the sinner who dies at 100 will be considered accursed. This is not symbolic language. Isaiah is describing a future state where the 120-year ceiling is lifted, where the biological reset of Genesis 6 verse 3 is reversed, where the genetic architecture of the pre-flood world is restored to humanity. The early church fathers read this as a description of the resurrection body, the glorified physical form that believers receive at the return of Christ. But it is also a description of a biological state, a genome without the telomeric ceiling, cells that divide without the Hayflick limit, tissue that regenerates without epigenetic suppression. What theology calls the resurrection body, molecular biology would call a telomerase unlimited organism operating without the epigenetic shutdown mechanisms introduced at the flood. These are not contradictory descriptions. They are the same reality described in two different vocabularies separated by 3,000 years. The decree of Genesis 6 verse 3 was biological. The reversal promised in Isaiah 65 will be biological. And the mechanism in both cases is the same. The architecture of human DNA, written by the same hand that wrote the stars. What we are left with is this. The lifespan data of Genesis is not mythology. It is a compressed biological record of an event that reshaped the human genome across identifiable generations in a documented timeline. The collapse from 900-year lifespans to 120-year lifespans is genetically explicable through telomere biology, the canopy collapse, and epigenetic inheritance. The 120-year ceiling of Genesis 6 verse 3 matches the maximum theoretical lifespan calculated from the Hayflick limit to the year. The Tower of Babel scattering explains the population genetics mechanism by which the shortened lifespan epigenetic changes were locked into every human lineage. And the longevity gene variants still present in isolated populations represent measurable genomic evidence of what we once were before the reset. The Church has spent centuries reading Genesis 6 verse 3 as theology. It is theology, but it is also biology. And the two readings do not compete. They confirm each other. Because the God who made the genome is the same God who spoke the decree. He didn't override the physics of the body he created. He adjusted the settings. He changed the parameters. He reset the clock. And somewhere in the architecture of your chromosomes, in the telomeric caps counting down on the ends of your DNA, the timestamp of that decision is still running. Every cell division brings you closer to the limit he set. And the only reversal ever promised is not a medical breakthrough or a longevity drug or a gene therapy developed in a laboratory. It is the same voice that set the limit in the first place, speaking again. And this time, lifting it permanently.